Hello everyone, welcome to another video for the Santa Fe and Disneyland Railroad Steam Simulator. Today we can take a quick look at one of the new features in Update 102, and that's the Interactive Fireman. This is probably the biggest feature to be added to the sim since the release, and that's because it transformed a single-player experience into a simulation of a multi-crew experience that you would find in the real cab. So let's go ahead and jump into the CK Holiday. Alright, so we can bring up the Fireman menu by pressing the F4 key, which will bring up this dialog. On the top half of the dialog we have the Fireman option, and on the bottom half we have the actual commands. Starting on the top left, you can select the fireman to operate the injectors, the firing controls, and the bell. For the injectors, the fireman will operate the injectors in order to keep the water level between 1.5 nut to 2 nuts here in the water sight glass on the left. For the bell, the fireman will operate the bell whenever we're crossing a grade or entering a station. And for the firing, of course, we'll operate the fuel valve here, the burner steam, as well as the blower whenever necessary. You can select to have a male or female fireman crew, and you can select the fireman experience between novice to expert. And finally, you can set a target pressure for the fireman between 105 psi to 150 psi. 125 psi is more prototypical of the Holiday since the 1950s, and recently the Holiday underwent a refurb, and now she operates at 150 psi. So you can select to run that pressure if you like. Below the options, we have the actual commands that you can use to enact the fireman. It's divided into the left side and the right side with a couple of miscellaneous commands in the middle. On the left side, you can command the fireman to set a particular fire level. Once you command a fire level, the fireman will no longer attempt to maintain the target pressure or the operating pressure, but instead the fireman will hold that fire temperature until you give him the next command. On the right side of the menu, this is more of a typical command, more typical commands that you would issue to the fireman. It includes prepare to depart, set drifting, and prepare to stop. In the middle, maintain pressure basically cancels any of these manual override commands and order the fireman to go ahead and resume maintaining the target or operating pressure. And the water check. We can ask the fireman to read out the current water level in the sight glass. And that's useful because when you're seated in the engineer seat on the right, you actually cannot see the water sight glass. So often the engineer will ask the fireman about the water level from time to time. In these days, if you get to have a tender ride on the Holiday or the Ripley, you actually see a second water sight glass on the engineer's side. So basically, this allows the engineer to keep an eye on the water level as well without having to constantly or occasionally ask the fireman. So let's go ahead and cover what these commands actually does. We'll cover the left side first. These manual fire commands, basically as I've said, they are manual override. It will, once you command them, the fireman will no longer attempt to hold the target pressure. And that's useful if you see the fireman start to fall behind, you're trying to start or pull a heavy train, and you see that the fireman is not building pressure fast enough. You can always manually ask him to set a medium or even a high fire and you immediately do so. Once you see that the pressure is starting to catch up to where you need to be, you can tell it to resume by commanding maintain pressure or one of these options, whichever is appropriate. The reason you might need to give manual command is that the Fireman in this version is no longer so robotic as in the previous version. Previously, if you ever used the auto firing feature, the Fireman basically is very, very good at his job. The pressure will almost always be pegged at 130 psi. It will never drop, it will never climb, no matter what you're doing on the throttle. Well, that's not so realistic, so this version, more of a human element has been added to the Fireman's logic. This means that even if you have the expert fireman experience setting, you still have to communicate to the fireman what you're doing. Because if you don't, the fireman will basically be playing catch up. In the real cab, both the fireman and the engineer will constantly communicate what they're about to do, and as well as monitoring what the other one is doing. For example, if I was a fireman in the left-hand seat, I might be watching how the engineer is pulling on the throttle. If the engineer is pulling a lot on the throttle, I would probably try to match that with my firing by opening up a hotter fire. If I see the engineer backing down on the throttle or hooking up the Johnson bar, I would probably back down on the fire because steam is no longer being drawn from the boiler at a fast rate. And this kind of dynamic is simulated in here to an extent. Basically, even though you might set an expert fireman here, you still have to be on the ball about how you're pulling the train. So let's go through some examples. First, let's try out these manual commands. Set spot fire.
Got it.
Basically orders the fireman to set the lowest possible fire. This is useful for maintaining boiler pressure when we're stationary. And at other times, this is a good way to let the boiler cool down and let the pressure come down. Especially useful if you see the pressure gauge starting to climb close to the safety trigger pressure. You can already see, since I command him to set the spot fire, the pressure is already starting to dip. Now let's order him to set a low fire and see what changes.
Okay.
You can see the firing valve starting to open up a little bit. You hear the atomizer or the burner steam getting a bit louder to match. You can hear the boiler starting to creak with the rising pressure. That's pretty self-explanatory. Let's go ahead and ask Mike to maintain the pressure.
Will do.
So now Mike will back down on the fire, as you can see on the firing valve. You can hear the steam from the burner is fading away. And that's because since we're stationary, we don't need a whole lot of fire to maintain 125 psi, so he's gonna try to let the pressure dip back down. For the other commands, prepare to depart. This orders the fireman to build up a pressure reserve for us to use in starting a train. So for a target of 125 psi, once we order Mike to prepare to depart, he might set something about 135 psi, maybe 140 even. And that gives us that pressure reserve to start the train. Once we're rolling down the tracks and we feel that we reached the speed that we need, we might try to hook up the Johnson bar a little bit to conserve steam, so we're going to tell Mike to set drifting. Basically, he's going to back the fire down. He will no longer try to set or try to keep a pressure that's higher than the target pressure. So for a target 125 again, he'll look to aim for 125 to 130. And he'll adjust the firing controls appropriately to allow the train to coast. Coasting does not require as much of steam, and therefore does not require as much of fire to maintain pressure, because we have increased draft to help stoke the fire. Prepare to stop is similar to drifting, but prepare to stop, he'll go ahead and back down the fire to conserve fuel and water, and might let the pressure dip down to about 120 to 105 for this target. Which is why, before we start the train, we're going to want to let the fireman know that we intend to start the train in a minute or so, which will allow him to build the pressure back up from 120 psi up to 125-30 psi or so. Which brings us to the next point and next tip. Aside issuing these commands, when should we issue them? Well, this is where the human factor comes in. If I was the engineer sitting here and I know that I need to start the train in about a minute, or maybe in about 30 seconds. If I see right now on the pressure gauge, we got a good pressure reserve going here. This is about 135, 136 psi. I probably won't need to issue the command very far in advance. I know that I have the pressure reserve already, and I know Mike will be able to keep up. On the other hand, if I have 120 psi, maybe even 115 psi because I've stopped for a long time, I'm going to want to issue this command a few minutes out before I need it, so that the fireman has the opportunity to build up that fire. And that goes pretty much the same with all the other commands. You have to anticipate your needs and communicate it before you need it. Like I said, even at expert setting, you still gonna see some mistake, especially if you don't communicate well. This is especially true once you set the fireman experience down to intermediate or even novice. What this setting does is that the target pressure of 125 psi, the range will now get quite a bit bigger, as a more novice fireman will try to hunt that target pressure. So when we're starting out, if you issue a prepare to depart command, the fireman might not be fast enough to build that pressure reserve, or might not even have a chance to build it. Same goes with these other manual override commands. A more novice fireman will be a little bit slower or more clumsy on the controls. This means that every time you order a command, you will almost never have the same experience. A novice or relatively intermediate fireman might even forget to operate the injectors or the bell when he's busy trying to catch up to the pressure. And all of this is simulated in the interactive fireman feature. So, I think we covered all the basics of what is in the new interactive fireman features and what the commands does. So in the next video, we'll go ahead and do a quick tutorial on actually using a fireman. See you next time.